Today's talk is the first of 4 talks on the subject of relationships, love, and spiritual practice. This is actually a very difficult topic because, as we all know, relationships are often very messy, and love is a subject that is often very difficult to define. There's a novel called Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and one of the characters says the line that hell is the suffering of being unable to love. Now, I know that many of the people watching this might be meditators, but even if we can attain clarity in our meditation, even if we have great insights, until we can truly surrender to love, our spiritual practice will never be genuinely fulfilling. So what can we say about love? Because as I said before, it's really difficult to talk about love. Love might mean many different things to different people. There's all different forms of love, like there's romantic love, there's friendship love, there's family love, there's sexual love, and so on. But the one thing that all of these different forms of love have in common is that they're all forms of what you could call personal love, where we tend to get very caught up in the highs and lows of emotion and of attachment. But there is another kind of love, and this other kind of love is not even exactly an emotion. It's more an inherent capacity, a capacity that comes out of our true nature. And this is what naturally comes forth when all the conditions that we usually add stop getting in the way. I'm talking about our agendas, our expectations, our desires. When they stop getting in the way, this love can naturally come forth. Yet, isn't it true that we rarely experience this kind of love? If you think about your own experience with relationships, you'll know that relationships are often more a source of difficulty than they are a source of love. And if you think about this, it's not just relationships with our mates that I'm talking about. We have difficulties with our parents, with our children. We have difficulties with our bosses and coworkers. We even have difficulties with our friends. And what's kind of interesting is that considering the amount of suffering that does come out of relationships, that Buddha didn't add relationships to his short list of sickness, old age, and death as the primary causes of suffering. But there is one thing that's certain, and we could all verify this for ourselves: relationships will often push us right to the edge of where we're personally stuck. So for today, I'd like you to keep in mind a particular relationship that you have, perhaps one that you have difficulties with, so that what I'm talking about will not just be words, it'll be more real, if you could relate it to your own experience. Now, if you were seeing a therapist about relationship difficulties, you'd probably talk about things like how to communicate better, or how to get your needs met, or maybe how to fix your problems. But for today, I want to move away from the narrow focus on how to fix relationship problems and instead look at the bigger picture of what spiritual practice is really about. And I think we could say that the bigger picture of spiritual practice is ultimately about realizing our true nature, which can be defined loosely as the living experience of connectedness and of love. The problem is, until we can see what's at the root of our relationship difficulties, our ability to really get in touch with our true nature or to experience genuine happiness will be blocked. And this is something we could all just see and experience for ourselves in our day-to-day life. So a good question is, why is there so much difficulty in relationships? Or more poignantly and more personally, what is it that each of us brings to relationships that seems to cause so much difficulties? And the answer is ourselves. That's what we bring. We bring our expectations, we bring our agendas, we bring our needs, and that's what ends up causing us a lot of problems. And if you look at it, what is the common denominator of almost all of our expectations and agendas? In other words, what is it that we really want? And the answer is, we want the other person to be a particular way. So just think about your own experience. How do you want the other person to be? Do you want them to be more appreciative? Do you want them to be more affectionate? Do you want them to take care of you? Do you want them to not criticize you? Maybe you just want them to be neat. But the point is, we always want the other person to be different in some way. The next question is, why do we want this? Why do we want the other person to be a particular way? And this is really an important point. And the answer is so that we'll feel a particular way. We want to feel appreciated. We want to feel wanted. We want to feel supported or secure. We want to feel pleasured. And that's really the driving force behind much of our dissatisfaction in relationship. Having expectations, which often we're not even aware of, that are not being met. And then, of course, when our expectations aren't met, what happens? We usually feel hurt, we feel angry, sometimes we feel afraid, sometimes we feel resentful, and this is the point where the messiness of relationships really begins. Almost all of us enter into relationships at least partially unaware of our expectations. I know when I was in my 20s, I met my first wife in a spiritual community. And at the time, I thought I wanted nothing more than to live my life and share it with someone, share a life of spiritual practice. And this was in part true, but what I didn't see was my subterranean agenda, which was I wanted someone to appreciate me. I wanted someone to pay attention to me. And even though this is very normal, because I wasn't aware of it, I wasn't aware of these expectations, they ended up causing both of us difficulties over a several-year period. So the point of all this is really the first and the most basic aspect in beginning to practice with relationship difficulties is to clearly and honestly see our own expectations. And particularly, because this has to be specific, to see how we want the other person to be, to see how we want that other person to make us feel. It's really the surrendering of our illusions about what a relationship is, what a relationship is supposed to do for me that is essential. But in order to surrender our illusions, we really have to see them clearly first. And that's the work in the beginning phase of working with ourselves in relationships. There's one particular practice question that's very helpful in letting us see our expectations. The question is, how is it supposed to be? Or it could be, how is he or she supposed to be? Or how am I supposed to be? But when we ask, how is it supposed to be? It will point us directly to our expectations. The problem is, we rarely ask the question, how is it supposed to be? What we actually ask most of the time is, how can I fix this? When we have a problem in a relationship, we want to get rid of it. We want to fix it. But there's a real flaw in our thinking here because we look at these difficulties as problems that need to be solved. But from a practice point of view, these are not problems to be solved. The difficulties are actually our path. Our difficulties in relationship are not obstacles on the path. They're the path itself. But what does this mean? What am I saying when I say our difficulties are our path? What I'm saying is our difficulties are the places where we're forced to turn our awareness on exactly what we need to work with within ourselves. So just for an example, take people who are embarrassing to you. Maybe they're too fat, or they're too thin, or maybe they're too loud, or they're too quiet, or maybe they're too uptight, or they're too loose, they're too something. So what happens when you see these people? Usually there's a judgment, there's a reaction, and then we want to do something to fix them. But we really have it upside down because this is not their problem, it's our problem. We're the ones who want them to be different. And in a way, this really isn't even our problem, it's our path. It's our stepping stone to go deeper into our own life. And this is really a change in perspective when we understand that our difficulties in relationship are an invaluable opportunity to get to know ourselves better, to see where we're stuck, and really to go deeper into our own experience. This is the only way we're ever going to get to work with the blockages that prevent the love which is our true nature from just naturally coming forth. If you think about it, isn't it true from your own experience that our difficulties are the place where we usually learn the most? And in a way, if you think about it, the people who are the most difficult are really good teachers for us. They're excellent teachers for us, but we have to be honest about this. Who really wants such a teacher? Nobody wants this teacher. What is it we really want? We want what we want. We want to feel good. We want to feel pleasured. We want to feel secured. We want to feel appreciated. We want to feel loved. We also want, and this is a more subtle point, we want our relationships, at least in part, to cover over the core fears or the core pain that are always lying in wait, the fears and the pain that we really don't want to feel. But the more we rely on relationships to either fill our needs or to cover over our core pain, the more we're just going to continue and solidify our suffering. And again, this is something we can experience for ourselves. We have to understand that another person can never really heal our pain. We can only do that for ourselves. And until we accept that, we're going to continue to be in trouble in relationships. Of course, it doesn't stop us from asking another person to do this because we still feel entitled that another person will take away our discomfort. And then when we don't get what we want, the messiness of relationships just continues. So think of your own particular situation again. And when you don't get what you want, or when you get what you don't want, that is when your expectations aren't met, what are your typical reactions? Just think about this for a moment. Do you usually get angry and blame? Or is your own particular strategy or style to withdraw, to go off by yourself, to protect yourself? Or maybe your style is to seek diversions, so, go off, have a pizza, go on the computer so that you don't have to feel anything. Whatever your reaction, and the point is you have to know what your own reaction is. We're almost always going to focus on the other person instead of looking inward. This is almost always true. Our first response is almost always to want them to be different so that our expectations, so that our desires can be fulfilled. When we get caught in this cycle of reacting to people, trying to fix things, it often leads to a power struggle. It often leads to even seeing the other person as the enemy. And then what do we end up doing? We erect barriers of protection, or we attack the other person in order to defend ourselves. So to the extent that we're not aware, and to the extent that really we're mechanically acting out of our own conditioning, our relationships are bound to follow this particular path. That whenever two people who don't quite know themselves reach the point of conflict, it's actually like a collision of machines. And just like all collisions, it's blind. And even though it's really easy to see how blind the other person is, our own blind spots are blind by definition, and we really don't see them. And it's interesting that even if we understand intellectually that all of these conflicts that we have in relationships are rooted in our expectations, when we're in the heat of the moment in a relationship, it's very difficult to see this. And even if we do see it, say we see it vaguely and we kind of remember this teaching, it's still very difficult to work with. And we have to just accept this as the reality of the situation, that it's difficult. Why is it difficult? The main reason it's difficult is because it means that we have to stop focusing on and blaming other people. It's a primary prerequisite in relationships that we have to refrain from blaming. So when we find ourselves blaming someone else, the practice is to turn our attention around and turn it towards ourselves. It does not mean that we blame ourselves. What it means is we give up blaming altogether. Not ourselves, not the other person, and not our childhood either. We just give up blaming. Of course, the problem is, and I think everyone knows this, we often don't want to give up our blaming. There's a part of us that actually likes being angry. We like being right. And when we blame, there's a certain juiciness or power that comes. There's a feeling like we're in control. So in a perverse way, it actually feels good to stay stuck in blaming. But, and this is the part we have to recognize, blaming is actually poisonous, not just to the other person who we're directing the blame toward. It's also poisonous to ourselves. So as much as we may want to blame and want to be right, our practice has to be to return again and again to the present moment of our own experience. And by that I mean first seeing clearly and with precision our own expectations, and then returning to the physical reality of the present moment, rather than focusing on what the other person did do or didn't do. In a way, when you really get to see these things more clearly, we understand that it's rarely about the other person. It's much more about what we've brought into the situation. Now, you may know this as you listen. You may have heard all of this before. It may sound maybe a little bit obvious, but the fact is, it's very, very easy to forget all of this. It goes right out the window when we're caught up in the heat of the moment. So during the next week, whenever even a small difficulty arises in relationship, my suggestion is to just pause and take a look and see if you really know what your expectations are. Ask yourself the question, how is it supposed to be? And by that, the specific answer would be, how is this other person supposed to be? How am I supposed to feel? This has to be the first step in working with a relationship difficulty. Once you could see the expectations clearly, and these are the expectations out of which all the difficulties arise anyway, then it's a little more straightforward to enter into the present moment of your own experience. What you're actually feeling, what's actually going on, that whole Gestalt sense of being present. So next week, as we continue with this, we're going to talk about what it means to actually be present, including what it means to be present with our own fears. So until then, over the next week, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, please feel free to write them in. And thank you very much. So last week, we talked about the necessity of seeing our own expectations in relationships, and particularly about seeing how we want the other person to be and how we want that other person to make us feel. Until we can see these expectations clearly, they're going to continue to cause havoc in our relationships. They're going to continue to dictate how we feel and how we act. And even if we understand intellectually that our emotional upsets are a result of the expectations that we bring on board, it's still hard to see this really clearly in those exact moments, in the heat of the moment, when we're very upset. Why? Because, as I mentioned last week, we often get caught up in blaming. However, when we find ourselves blaming someone else, our practice has to be to turn away from blaming and then turn inward, turn toward our own experience. So I'm not talking about blaming ourselves. As I said last week, this means giving up blaming altogether. We're not blaming ourselves, we're not blaming the other person, and we're not blaming our upbringing or our childhood. The problem is, and this is the part we all know well from the inside, we often do not want to give up blaming. We like that juiciness and power that we feel when we're right, and so we hold on to being angry, and we hold on to being blaming. But the thing we have to realize is that blaming is very poisonous. It's poisonous not just to the other person, but it's equally poisonous to ourselves. So as much as we may want to blame and may want to be right, the practice has to be to turn away from blaming and come back again and again to the physical reality of our own experience. And that includes seeing our expectations clearly, and it also includes just coming back to our own present moment experience. One thing it's always good to remember is that it's rarely about the other person, at least just the other person. We always have something to do with it when we have difficulties in relationships. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper. What is the bottom line underneath all of our emotional upsets in relationships? If you think about it, the answer is always going to come up to be fear. Fear is literally underneath almost all of our emotional upsets, from anger to hurt to resentment, all of it. So let's just take some examples. What are the things that we're afraid of? We might be afraid of rejection. We could be afraid of feeling unworthy, or we could be afraid of feeling unworthy of love. For some people, there's the fear of intimacy itself. Some people are afraid of losing control in a relationship. Some people are afraid of being controlled. Some people, of course, are afraid of being alone. All of these fears play a huge role in the difficulties that come up in relationships. But the real point is, do you know your own fear or fears? Do you know the fears that come up for you when you get caught in relationship difficulties? So one slant on practice is, when you get stuck in a relationship, along with looking at your expectations, to really see if you could see what fear is playing into this. And a very simple question you could ask yourself is, what is the fear? What am I afraid of? Normally, we don't even ask this question. If we're angry, we're just angry, and we think that's the sum total of it. But 99% of the time when we're angry, what's really going on is that we're afraid. The interesting thing is that these fears are not logical or reasonable. You know, if you believe that you're unworthy of love, it doesn't mean it's true. The only thing it means is that you believe it's true. And as long as you believe it's true, it's going to affect how you react and relate to the other person. And so the point of this is, we have to begin to see our own fears, since they're almost always at the root of our relationship difficulties. And a good example of this, which I want to talk about a little bit, is the basic fear of aloneness or disconnection, which can also manifest as the fear of loss. And many people experience the fear of aloneness. It's often called the fear of abandonment. In fact, many people will do anything to avoid this fear. Many people enter into relationships, or if they're in relationships, they engage in affairs outside of the relationship, just so they don't have to experience the discomfort of feeling alone. Ultimately, however, the willingness to let loneliness just be, and by that I mean to be really present with it, is the only way to transcend it. It's also the only way to develop true intimacy with another person, because intimacy with another person can never be based on our neediness or on our fear of being alone. If we need people in this way, we can't truly love them. We're always going to be relating to them through this very small filter of our own neediness, our own needs. Still, we want and we expect other people to take away our fears. It's just kind of how we're wired, or how we're brought up. So for example, if we have the fear of being alone, the fear of abandonment, we expect another person to pay attention to us, and if they pay attention to us, then we won't have to feel this fear. But if this fear is part of our makeup, all it takes is for our partner to be deeply engrossed in a book when we want them to pay attention to us, for it to trigger this whole fear of being alone and being abandoned. All we have to do is observe this within ourselves, again, to see that this is true. We may try and deal with this by demanding their attention, but even if they give us their attention, it's only going to satisfy this fear temporarily. It's not going to really address the fear. It's like putting a Band-Aid over it for the time being. And furthermore, even getting the attention we desire does not mean we're going to be able to experience true intimacy with the other person. True intimacy has to be based on our willingness to stay present with our own fears. And by that I mean to actually feel them in the body. The truth is, we don't want to feel them, and we all know that. But what I'm saying is the practice, when we get down to this level of practice, we have to see this clearly enough so that we're willing to take that step where we're willing to say yes to, yes, I'm willing to feel my fear. I'm willing to actually face this instead of asking another person to take it away from me. Unfortunately, sometimes loneliness, the fear of loneliness, feel so strong that we really may believe that we can't stand it for another second. And there is a practice that we could do when this happens. The practice is to just take a breath into the center of the chest, into the area of the heart. You actually breathe the sensations of loneliness right into the center of the chest on the in-breath, where you could feel them most deeply. And then on the out-breath, you just exhale. You're not trying to let anything go. You're not trying to change your experience. You're just breathing out. And then on the next breath again, you breathe the loneliness in. And maybe you could just deal with this one breath at a time. But as you work with this in this way, you develop the courage to be able to go on and to really stay with the experience. As we can stay with the loneliness in this way, in other words, as we stop pushing it away and instead let it in, this is where the loneliness can actually be healed. And I'm talking about being healed from the inside. And also when we can learn to really reside in our loneliness and really stay with it and develop a sense of equanimity with it, we'll no longer ask the person we're with to take away our discomfort. We'll understand that this is not even an appropriate request to ask of another person. And instead, maybe it's possible that we'll begin to know what it means to feel genuine love in a relationship, instead of love that's based on needs or wanting to feel a particular way. In a way, the task I'm talking about is very straightforward, but it's very difficult to do. And what I'm talking about is to refrain from the storyline of drama and blame, and instead come back to the present moment of our own experience, and just to stay there. In fact, the crux of this practice, when we stay with our experience, is learning what it means to say yes to our fears. So what does it mean to say yes? Because it certainly doesn't mean we'd like our fears, and no one is saying you should like your fears. But to say yes to your fears means you're actually willing to feel them fully, instead of what we normally do, which is try and get away from them or try and do something to change them. I know that it's true that sometimes we might think that we can't stand to feel our fears. We really believe this, but of course we can. The truth is that we just don't want to, and we have to recognize this. So that crucial step of learning to say yes is when we've gotten over this hurdle of thinking, I can't do this. We can do it, we just don't want to do it. But at some point we learn that we have to do it if we want to find genuine happiness in relationships. When we're caught in our emotional reactions, and especially when we're caught in fear, there's one particular practice that's very helpful. I've been using this practice for many years. It's to ask the question, what is this? The question, what is this, is actually a Zen koan, because like any koan, there's no way you could answer this by thinking or by analyzing or by logic or by reason. We're not asking, what is this fear about? We're asking, what is it? So when you ask the question, what is this? The only answer is your present moment experience itself. It's an ever-changing answer. But when you ask this question, you can focus in like a laser on what you're actually feeling. So for right now, let's just do a little experiment. I'd like you to ask yourself the question, what is this? And as you ask it, begin by focusing on a narrow range of your experience. Just bring your attention to the breath in and out of the nose. And as you breathe in, you could feel the coolness as it enters your nostrils. And as you breathe out, you could feel the subtle texture of the breath. What does it actually feel like to breathe? And then asking this question again, what is this? Bring your attention to the area in the torso. Feel whatever sensations might be there, however subtle. Feel the energy moving through the body. asking again, what is this? It's like you're focusing a laser on yourself and your own experience, that gestalt experience of just being here. Maybe the words that would describe this most would be, I am here. That's the feeling when you really get into the real answer to this question, what is this? Now, this was just a very brief example, but perhaps by asking this question, you got a taste of what it might be like to get out of the head, even if only momentarily, and actually into the bodily experience of the present moment. You could do this exact same process when fear arises. When fear arises, when you recognize you're caught in fear, you ask, what is this? And then you bring your attention, almost with the curiosity of a scientist, to the physical experience in the body, including perhaps the tightness in the jaw or the constriction in the chest or the queasiness in the belly. And you just stay there and just study it, feel it. What is this? What is this experience? It's very different from what we normally do when we're caught up and we're in the middle of it. Very different. It's like night and day. And this process of really staying physically present with our experience is what allows genuine transformation to take place. As we become less defended and more open, what is it that we see? We see that what we're so intent on defending is just thoughts and just bodily sensations and just memories. And that's all. And yet it was this big solid thing that totally blocks our ability to live genuinely. But when we can see through it, it changes our perception of what's going on entirely. Once we can really begin to face our fears in this way, which means to really be able to feel them, to really feel them fully, we're no longer a slave to them. And no longer do we have to continue the painful life of reactions and defendedness, which we often get so caught up in. There's one other practice technique which I want to mention, which is very helpful in the heat of the moment when the emotion we're experiencing might seem to be too much to bear. And it's called the 3 breaths practice. And with this practice, you make a deal with the ego that you're going to feel your experience just for the duration of 3 full breaths. And then when the 3 full breaths is over, you go off into some diversion or fantasy, just whatever your form of chocolate is. The ego is willing to go along with this because it knows there's a very time-limited thing and it could take over. The ego knows it will be able to take over again. So when you do this, the 3 breaths, you make sure that you really pay attention to that emotion that you don't want to pay attention to. And you really feel it for just the duration of 3 breaths. You don't renege on the deal. When the 3 breath is over, you allow yourself to go off and turn your attention away. But then a little later on, you come back again and again, always for just 3 breaths at a time. And you'll see what could happen by this. At some point, it just gradually develops the courage to really be able to stay with experiences which we thought we really can't stand to be with. You have to remember that one of the most basic principles of spiritual practice is that it's awareness that heals. It's awareness that makes our suffering less solid. As we begin to see through our fears, and as they lose their solidity and become more porous, at that point, the love, which is our true nature, can begin to flow through us more naturally. The blockages begin to be removed, or at least dismantled to some extent. There's a wonderful quote from the 19th century philosopher Nietzsche. He said, "One must have chaos within oneself in order to give birth to a dancing star." And what does this mean? In relationships, we're often going to be pushed to the edge. We're going to enter into our own personal chaos. But out of this chaos, when we work with it consciously, the part that can emerge is genuine love. That's what the dancing star is. Genuine love can emerge. But first it requires that we attend to where we're stuck with conscious awareness. I know it's true that the chaos and our own fears is the place where we least want to be, But we have to understand that the willingness to pay attention to our fears is absolutely key. So at this point, I'd like to summarize the major ideas from these first two talks. First, we need to remember that whenever we feel distress in a relationship, that it's our opportunity to wake up to exactly what we need to work with within ourselves. And in this way, we can learn to actually welcome our relationship difficulties as our path. When we understand them in this way, it makes a huge difference. Second, we have to remember that everybody has expectations in relationships, and our job is to learn to see them clearly and to see them with precision, particularly focusing on how is it that we want to feel, because that's really the bottom line of what dictates all of our reaction. And remember, when I say you need to look at your expectations, I don't mean just generally. I mean to look at them very precisely, to be able to define them with clarity and with honesty. Third, we need to be able to refrain from our normal protective strategies, and I'm talking particularly about blaming and self-justifying. We need to be able to put them aside in order to be able to continue the work on relationships. And the fourth and final one, and I can't emphasize this one enough, we need to learn what it means to be present, and by that I mean physically present with our own experience, especially when we have strong emotional reactions like anger or hurt, and especially with fear. And we do this, we become present with them by physically entering into the bodily experience of the present moment, even if it's only for 3 breaths at a time. And this is how we use relationships, taking these steps one at a time. This is how we use relationships to awaken to the genuine life of connectedness that all of us aspire to. I'm really talking about returning to our true nature, the inherent connectedness that we already have with everybody. But in order to do this, we have to work with what blocks it, our beliefs, our emotions, our behaviors. What I really want you to get is that it's possible to experience this. This is not some faraway place that I'm talking about, but what is required is, of course, is effort and honesty, and perhaps above all, what is required is perseverance. So during this next week, I'd like to suggest that you work with the question or koan, what is this? When you get caught in a relationship difficulty, you could pause and ask yourself the question, what is this? Bringing attention to whatever it is that you're feeling in the body, and see what it is you could learn from doing this. Next week, as we continue, I want to put a little bit more emphasis in talking about what it actually means to experience love in relationships. But in the meantime, keep working with looking at your expectations, asking the question, what is this? And then if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to write them in, and if I can, I will answer them. Thank you. Last week, we talked a lot about being present with our fears, of actually feeling them. Now, it's possible that all of this may sound quite bleak to you. Perhaps it seems like a one-sided or somewhat dark view of relationships. Maybe you'd rather just lighten up and forget all about the grim talk about working with your pain and working with your fear. Maybe you want to ask questions like, what about the joy in relationships? But see, the answer to this is obvious. If we could simply lighten up and find joy in our relationships, we would. But to the extent that there are difficulties in our relationships, and even to the extent that our good relationships can become better, we have to be willing to work with our own particular blind spots and stuck places. There was a 19th century Christian existentialist named Søren Kierkegaard, and he came up with the great line that perfect love is to love the one through whom you became unhappy. I want to repeat that. Perfect love is to love the one through whom you became unhappy. If you want to put this another way, the more that we work with our own reactions, the more that the path is cleared for love to naturally flow through us. See, the thing is, we don't have to open our hearts. The heart is already open. But what we have to do is work with the obstructions that prevent us from experiencing that openness. Now, this gets particularly difficult in relationships because one strange twist in relationships is often what another person wants most from us is what most difficult for us to give. It's not logical, it's just how it often works out, and you just observe your own situation to see if this is true. And this twist, in a way, shines a light on what Kierkegaard meant when he said that perfect love comes out of the experience of being unhappy in relationships. If we see where we're stuck in not wanting to give to the other person what the other person wants, and if we're willing to work with the layers and layers of anger and fear within that stuck place, that right there is the path. It's the path to freedom and the path to happiness in relationships. So to counter our fear-based withholding, our not wanting to give to the other person what the other person wants, it might require, on our part, the intentional acts of giving, but not in order to be virtuous. We're not doing this in order to see ourselves as a virtuous person or for other people to see us as a virtuous person. We're really doing this to push ourselves to our own edge so that we could work with our own fears. That's the whole point of it. The more honestly and clearly we can work with our own fears, the less they're going to dictate our behavior. So in other words, as we give in a relationship and as we work with what gets in the way of giving, we heal. And as this happens, then the giving can become a more natural act. Instead of having to do it intentionally as a work to give, it starts to come forth naturally from a more open heart. So I want to give an example of how this works. When my wife Elizabeth and I first got together as a couple, and this is about 20 years ago now, I was still working on my own particular tendencies to be critical and judgmental. And I had seen the harm that it had caused in relationships. And I was very clear in myself that I did not want to continue this, the judgmental, the critical behavior. It was also very clear that Elizabeth wasn't the least bit interested in being fixed by me. So I made it my practice almost as soon as we got together to avoid all judgments and criticisms of her whenever possible. Now, you can imagine this was quite difficult because if you think about it, what is an ego if not a collection of judgments and opinions, all of which we believe? And no sooner does a judgment rise across our mental screen and when we believe it, and it's very difficult for us to keep our mouth shut in those moments. However, for me, in making my effort to not express my critical judgments toward her, I learned something amazing. What I learned was that my judgments were rarely about her. They were almost always about me. And the perfect example of this lies in our very different styles regarding possessions. I like owning very little. Elizabeth, on the other hand, really likes to go to thrift stores and bring home little treasures. And it's not that she's materialistic. She just likes bringing home a little load from Goodwill. It's her joy, whereas my joy is to throw something out. And then the things that I do own, I like to keep very neat and orderly. And Elizabeth, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. She likes to keep everything out there where she could see it. Now, it might seem like my style, being neat, simple, orderly, is more Zen-like. And I really did believe this to be true before I met Elizabeth and started doing this practice. But when I started doing this practice of withholding criticisms, I began to see things very differently. So when a criticism would arise, instead of just expressing it, I began to look more carefully at my own inner state. If I had just expressed the judgments, I never would have looked inside and seen my inner state. And what is it that I saw? I saw fear. I saw the fear of chaos, the fear of loss of control. It wasn't that my behaviors of neatness and orderliness was some great Zen virtue as much as it was a strategy of control, a way of avoiding having to feel the fear of chaos or the fear that things were out of control. And when I learned this, it made it really quite easy to withhold my criticisms and judgments that might arise towards Elizabeth, because I realized that they were really about me. And I didn't have to ask her to take away my discomfort in these situations. I could just deal with it from the inside. Now, unfortunately, ordinarily, when we're in relationships, we assume that it's the other person's job to take away our discomfort. But from a practice point of view, nothing could be further from the truth. Our discomfort is our job. And we really have to understand what that means. But what's so interesting about human dynamics is once we attend to our job, which is working with our own fears, working with our own discomfort, usually it frees the other person to eventually move towards us. And you could experiment with this to see if it's true. So you see, when the other person no longer feels the need to defend, within that kind of sense of spaciousness, they might be willing to work on their part of the equation. They might be willing to attend to their job. This is so different from what we normally do, which is trying to change the other person or have them do what we want so that we'll have our needs met. I'm not talking about trying to change them. I'm talking about the fact that the changes just come on their own when a person no longer feels the need to defend. So I'd like to suggest the following exercise. Maybe you could get something out of this the same way that I did. I'd like you to pick someone that you have a relatively close relationship with, someone that you see fairly often. And you're going to make it a practice for just one day during the week, from the moment you wake up in the morning until you go to bed at night, to withhold all criticisms and judgments of the other person. It's not that they won't arise, because they will arise. When they do arise, though, number one, they're not going to come out of your mouth. That's the practice. And number two, you're not going to start spinning them and replaying them in your head. You notice them because they're there, but then the real practice is to turn the attention inward and feel the physical component. What does it actually feel like in the body to hold on to this belief or this judgment? There'll be definitely a tension or a contraction in the body. Now, this exercise is not designed to try and change your behavior. It's designed to allow you to see. Because in giving non-judgment to another person, which is what everybody wants, and which is also one of the hardest things to give, we're actually giving ourselves a great gift. We're giving ourselves the opportunity to see that our judgments about the other person are rarely about the other person, that they're almost always about us. And when we understand this, we can learn a great deal about ourselves. This also gives us the understanding to work more directly with our own fears and our own attachments, because we're not focusing so much on the other person anymore. We're really looking at ourselves. But just one note, if you do this exercise of doing a one whole day practice of withholding judgments of another person, you really need to do it for a few weeks. 1 week is not a good sample because it may be anything on one given week, but if you do it over a period of several weeks, you'll get a good sampling and you'll be able to really learn what it's possible to learn from doing this. On the path of spiritual practice, one of the most basic assumptions that all of us have is that we have an inner quest to awaken. In a way, you could look at this, that it's our true nature that's striving to reveal itself. Now, we may sense this in ourselves at times, but often it's very difficult to see this inner quest in another person. But when we relate to another person from our small mind, that's the mind of fear, the mind of desire, we're almost always going to relate to the small mind of the other person. And this is that place out of which almost all of our relationship conflicts arise. However, if we can relate to the other person from our bigger mind, and by that I'm talking about our desire to live more awake, our desire to live more open, more genuinely, when we can relate to another person from that place, we can relate also to the bigger mind of that other person as well. Now, I know that this is often difficult to see in another person, that they also have the same desire to awaken that we do. Often it's difficult to see it in ourselves when things are difficult, but more so in another person. I know when Elizabeth and I got married, we made one essential vow in our wedding ceremony, and that was the vow to remember that each of us had the desire to awaken. And so when difficulties would arise, when there would be a conflict, our essential vow was to remember that the other person, just as much as ourselves, really had the inmost desire to be free from illusion. And that one vow, that one remembrance, has served us so well in allowing us not to fall into the small mind with all of the judgments and all of the conflicts that come out of that. Now, to assume this wish in another person, especially in moments of difficulty, is often very hard to do. It's much more easy to get caught in blaming or in trying to fix the other person. But to the extent that we could come back again and again to remembering that they too have the wish to awaken, it will make genuine relatedness possible. As we become more free from our own conditioning and our own fears, the love and connectedness that's possible in relationship can begin to flow through us more naturally. And as our defenses are lowered, and this is a very interesting twist, the desire to give to the other person becomes a natural inclination of the open heart. It's an actual reflection of what love is, the wanting to give to the other person. And in fact, we could discover that genuine happiness in relationship is not a result of having our needs met or of getting what we think we want. Genuine happiness in relationship is really about freely giving to the other person in order to bring happiness to them. In a way, it's turning upside down, or I should say right side up, our whole normal view of relationships. About relationships are supposed to be making me happy. Actually, if you think about it, nearly every parent knows this at some point, because they're giving unselfishly to the children is almost like a natural desire. But unfortunately, even as a parent, as the children grow up and relationships get more complex, and as fear begins to supersede our natural desire to give, even that gets fuzzy, the natural unselfishness of a parent. So giving from the heart in relationship eventually requires that we give up our sense of entitlement. Our sense of entitlement that relationships are just about me, that they're supposed to make me feel good, and also our deeply seated belief that it's the other person's job to take care of us in this way, to take away our discomfort. That's a sense of entitlement that we need to be able to see through. So for another experiment this week, I'd like you to pick one person that you have a close relationship with. And I'd like you to see if you can kind of see into them and see what they really want from you the most. And see how much you really don't want to give that certain something to that person. And then as a practice, as an exercise, try and give them that, what they want. But don't tell them about it. You just do this on your own. And when you do this practice, when you give the person what they want, which you don't want to give, your practice is just to observe everything that comes up. Observe your thoughts. Observe the discomfort that comes up around this. You just watch all of it. That's the practice, and see what comes out of this. Maybe you'll even see the possibility for genuine love to emerge between the cracks when you are able to give up the sense of withholding, which all of us seem to, this protective stance of not wanting to give to the other person, even when, if this is the person we love, you would think you'd want to give them what they want, but it's not how it usually works. We can, in fact, discover the very simple and profound truth that love in relationships is not about getting what we want. Love in relationships is really about making the other person happy, much more so than having that relationship make us happy. And I'm not talking about this as a should, that this is how it should be. I'm talking about this is the natural understanding that comes forth when fear no longer impedes us, which is why, of course, we have to work with our fears first for love to eventually emerge. Now, my hope is that in listening to some of the ideas in this particular talk, that maybe you got a little bit different view on relationships and what it means to love in relationships. And work with the two practices. One of them would be to, for a whole day, to withhold judgments of another person, to see what that would bring up for you, to see what you could learn about yourself. And then the other practice is to picking someone close to you, give them what they want that you don't want to give, and then work with everything that comes up around this and see what you could discover from that. And in the meantime, during the week, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to email them, and I will answer as I can. Thank you. For the fourth and concluding talk on relationships as spiritual practice, I want to talk about the crucial subject of forgiveness and to relate it to the possibility of genuine happiness in relationships. Perhaps one of the commonest places that all of us get stuck, and also as a consequence, one of the places that most prevents genuine happiness, is when we are caught holding on to resentments. If you think about it, if there's even one person that you can't forgive, it closes the heart in bitterness. And it will also prevent us from ever experiencing, at least fully, the genuine happiness of equanimity. What's interesting is that forgiveness is actually an inherent quality of the awakened heart. The problem is it doesn't come to us naturally. Forgiveness is really hard work. If you just think about how tenaciously you hold on to being right when you think somebody has done you wrong, even when you know that holding on to the bitterness is making you unhappy, we hold on to it anyway. It's just a perverse wiring in human beings. I know during my first marriage, my former wife and I got into the usual power struggles and kind of dug in, holding on to our grudges. And then even after we separated, and even though we were pretty good friends, there was still a little edge to our conversations. And I noticed that her, more than anyone, could trigger my anger. So at some point, I realized what was going on, and I decided to approach it by doing a forgiveness meditation. But what amazed me was how much resistance there was to even the idea of forgiving her. So part of the particular practice I was doing, there was a meditation involved. And the idea was you would picture the other person. So I'd picture my former wife and see her image. And then the practice is to try and breathe that image into the center of the chest, into the heart. But when I try and breathe her in, I was met literally with a visceral no. It was just my body was saying, no, don't come in. Fortunately, the meditation that I was doing was structured to allow for this resistance. The instruction was to, instead of trying to jump over the resistance or let the resistance go, the instruction was just to feel it physically in the body. You may already know this, but it's very easy to focus on the shortcomings of another person or to blame another person's behavior for our particular anger. Of course, in my case, in this example with my former wife, my anger and my resentment were really a way, at least in part, of allowing me to avoid feeling the feelings that I really didn't want to feel, which was a sense of hurt and a sense of betrayal. But it gradually had become more and more clear to me that in holding on to the resentments, that what was happening was I was certainly cutting myself off from my own heart and also certainly cutting myself off from her. And as easy as it might have been to blame her for my emotional distress, the truth was, in holding on to my resentments, I really had lost my own way. In in the spiritual practice that I was doing, I was way off base every time that I was focusing on what she did or didn't do. So as I said, fortunately, I started doing the forgiveness meditation. And as the resistance softened, and as I was able over time to refrain from the blaming, then the other emotions, which were somewhat below the surface, started to arise. So in the beginning, of course, there was a layer of hurt. There was a very strong layer of grief and sadness, of loss. There was also, surprising to me, there was a deeper experience of powerlessness that I felt. And then, even more than that, the very strong experience of disconnection, which was really at the bottom of all of it. But as I stayed with these experiences one at a time, and by that I mean I would breathe the sensations of each layer, of the hurt, of the sadness, of the disconnection. I would breathe the sensations right into the center of the chest, into the heart. And gradually I experienced what you could call the healing power of the heart. And what's so interesting, it was at that point, it became very clear to me that she never intended to hurt me, which was, of course, how I looked at it earlier. When I could see clearly that the resentment and the power struggle came out of our mutual blindness and our mutual hurt, then the experience of forgiveness came forth naturally. I was very easily able to breathe her image into the heart and to actually say the words, "I forgive you." It was a very different experience of who she was. Truthfully, it took both of us, because she was working on this at the same time as me. It took both of us years of kind of fumbling around and stumbling around to get to this place where we really were able to forgive each other. But by the time that she died, when this was around 3 years ago, we had truly forgiven one another and had learned to love one another as friends. And this is something that I'm certain would never have been possible if we both hadn't learned what it took to actually forgive the other person. I heard the Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, tell this very interesting story, which I'm assuming is true. It's about a golfer who won a golf tournament, and the people at the tournament gave him a check. And so he's walking out into the parking lot, and this woman comes up to him and starts telling him this heart-wrenching story about her sick son and how she has no money and the son's going to die unless he gets help. So immediately the golfer signs the check over and gives it to her. Then a month goes by, and one of his buddies comes up to him and says, "I heard about what happened with you and that woman, how you gave her the check, but I also heard that this woman was a con artist and she didn't even have a son." So the golfer reflects on this for a moment, and he said, "Well, actually, that's the best news I've heard all day. At least I know a sick child is not going to die." Now, if you think about it, it would have been so easy for the golfer to get caught up in the fear of betrayal and to feel bitterness toward the woman. And if he did feel that way, no doubt all of his friends would have agreed with him and supported him in his feelings. But for whatever reason, this golfer had the good sense to listen to the voice of his heart, which is much more concerned with the welfare of other people than it is with holding grudges. I think we have to understand that it may be easy for us to be kind and also to be forgiving when our life is going well. But it's really only when our life gets difficult that the depth of our spiritual practice can be revealed, that the depth of our spiritual practice can be tested. For our kindness to be real, it can't depend on how another person treats us, nor can it depend on how we're feeling in the moment. And I want to repeat this. For our kindness to be real, it cannot depend on how another person is treating us, nor can it depend on how we're feeling emotion in that moment. The truth is, when we feel mistreated, kindness is usually the farthest thing from our minds and from our hearts. And we have to be honest about this, that this is just the truth. Yet, we also have to recognize that for genuine happiness to be possible, we have to be willing to go to that deeper place inside of us where genuine forgiveness, where genuine kindness can really be accessed. And what this means, essentially, is that we have to be willing to go toward and work with wherever we're blocked. One of the most important things I've learned from doing the forgiveness practice is really to never underestimate how hard it is for us to give up our resentments. Even when we see how much the resentment is hurting us by holding on to it, we sometimes will still hold on to it with a kind of stubbornness that defies common sense. But fortunately, part of the practice of forgiveness, and also part of the path towards genuine happiness, is to work with wherever we're blocked. In other words, we start where we are, not where we would like to be. And if where we are is stuck in being blocked in resentment, then we have to be willing to work with that. So now when I teach forgiveness practice to students, I really try and emphasize to them the importance of working with the resistance, of staying present with it, physically present with it, for as long as it takes. And the really good thing about that, when we're willing to stay present with it, we can learn a great deal about ourselves. And again, this is something that we have to see for ourselves. We have to work with for ourselves to see that it's true. One important question is, what makes forgiveness practice so difficult? Why is it that we want to hold on to resentment? And I think it's a really important question to look at within ourselves. If you think about it, part of it has to do with the complexity of what happens when someone says or does something that hurts us. We often will have a reaction that's relating not only to the incident that just happened, but to all our many associations of past hurts that get stirred up in the moment. So we're not just reacting to that hurt, we're reacting to this deep well of pain that may never have been addressed before. What happens is that feelings of worthlessness, powerlessness can be triggered. And of course we react with defensiveness and react with resentment, because that allows us not to have to feel the vulnerable feelings that we don't want to feel. Resentment is like a hard protective crust that allows us not to have to go deeper inside and feel the sadness or the hurt or the grief that's in there. And the way this usually manifests is we're going to end up blaming the other person. We elevate ourselves by putting that other person down. And as we feed our anger through this blaming, it gradually hardens and solidifies into resentment, and really into a bitter form of resentment. And really the saddest part of this whole dynamic of falling into this whole syndrome of anger and blame and resentment is that, and you can experience this for yourself, is that our lives become very small and very narrow. And we're destined to experience the ongoing unhappiness of living from a closed heart. There's an old Hebrew proverb that says, when you live to seek revenge, you dig 2 graves. And if we allow our lives to close down in resentment, we have to come to understand that it's hurting ourselves at least as much as it's hurting another person. And this is why the first step in the forgiveness practice always is to feel the remorse from living from a closed heart. We have to see how this is really hurting ourselves. And as we develop this understanding that by holding on to resentment, we're hurting ourselves, perhaps more than the other person ever hurt us, that might be the pivotal turning point where we can begin to actually enter into and work with the forgiveness practice. Because otherwise there's just too much resistance and we don't want to do it. So for me now, whenever even little feelings of resentment pop up, I always ask myself the question, can I surrender to what is? And that means, can I really be present with what is right now, even if it's the yucky feelings that I don't want to feel? And what I have found is, time and time again, it's coming back to the present moment of our own experience. And by that I mean breathing those sensations, those unwanted sensations, unpleasurable sensations, breathing them right into the center of the chest. That is really the key. And of course, in order to do this, we have to be willing not to indulge our thoughts, our blame toward the other person. So refraining from blaming and being willing to stay present really with what is. And when we can do this, we can learn about the absolute freedom that Zen has always talked about. But it can't be theoretical. And the only way to get to this place is to be willing really to stay present with those things which we've never wanted to stay present with. Now, we may not need to engage in a forgiveness practice very often, but as long as we're caught in resentment, however small it is, our ability to be free, our ability to live from the genuine happiness of equanimity, it will be blocked. But it's the practice of forgiveness that guides us through the blockage as we let layer after layer of anger and fear fall away in the process. And more than anything, the practice of forgiveness allows us to reconnect with our own hearts. And when we can do that, the inherent value of this becomes just more than obvious to us. So you could think about this, whether you're ready and willing to engage in a forgiveness practice. It's admittedly difficult, but as difficult as it is, it's equally valuable and worthwhile. In my new book, which is called Beyond Happiness, The Zen Path to True Contentment, there's a written guided forgiveness practice that's very straightforward. And many people have tried it and found it helpful. And if you would like to do an actual forgiveness practice like I've done, you might want to refer to it and see if it helps you too. And one last thing, please keep in mind that in order to really engage in a forgiveness practice, often we have to experience the genuine remorse toward our own behavior. I'm talking about remorse for the mistakes that we have made in relationships. Often people keep making the same mistakes without really ever learning anything. And this leads me to a joke about a guy who used to drink too much and do really dumb things. So one day he was walking down the street and he had these 2 big blisters on his ears. And he ran into a friend of his, and his friend said, "Hey, what happened to you? What's up with the blisters?" And he said, "Oh, I was home and my wife was ironing and she left the iron on and I had too much to drink. And then the phone rang and I picked up the iron by mistake." And his friend said, "Well, that's really bad, but that's one ear. What happened to the other ear?" And the drinker said, "Well, the jerk called back." So the moral of this story is the next time that your phone rings, instead of picking up the iron and hurting yourself and maybe hurting another person, just pause, take a breath into the center of the chest, into the heart, and come back to reality. We don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes. So during this next week, you could reflect on whether you want to do the forgiveness work. And again, please feel free to write in any comments you might have, any questions you might have. And thank you very much for your participation.